Olivia Greenhouse, SPRT 2012, student number 120100619.
What type of assessment did you choose to focus on and why?
So Susan Capel in 2004 defined assessment as an integral part of learning and teaching. So assessment for learning is a formative type of assessment, which means it's informal, it's based on judgment of the teacher, making progress throughout the lesson, there's no grades, it's where pupils are now, where they're going, open-ended questions is an example of assessment for learning, whereas assessment of learning is a summative type of assessment. It's formal, so it could be end-of-term exams and grades. Blanchard actually explained that summative overlooks the progress and is more concerned with the end product rather than the process of learning. So I chose to focus on formative assessment in my lesson. And that's because in the lesson I wanted to improve learning and challenge the pupils to move forward. I did this by using the resource card. So I use open questions on the resource card, which is an informal type of assessment. In the lesson, I progressed the activities based on judgment as to how the pupils were progressing. I used open questions to determine this, so I asked them throughout. I asked pupils to tell me ideas rather than just telling them the answers, which increased their confidence. So I understood their knowledge through open questions, allowing me to develop the lesson accordingly, and I could rephrase questions to link them back to the learning objective when I needed to, when we went a bit off track. Peer assessment of the shouters is an example of formative assessment I used in the lesson. I think that I could increase the pace of the lesson based on the answers, and I could build a rapport with the pupils by asking their names when asking them for questions. Communication, teamwork skills were developed through peer assessment as well, and it also challenged their in-depth thinking. I think with the open questions, I noticed that not every person was contributing, which affected those who didn't contribute, their personal confidence. So in the future, I would encourage them to contribute, and I would empower pupils further by developing the questions more. So I'd say, for example, what does that mean, or could you relate that to a real life situation?
How does this type of assessment link with the NCPE or OAI?
So the National Curriculum 2013 states that Key Stage 2 pupils should take part in outdoor and adventurous activity to challenge the pupils individually and as in a team. So I think formative assessment links to this within peer assessment, because the pupils cooperatively worked in the physical activity, and I think they increased their confidence because they worked together to communicate, share ideas with each other in the lesson. And also I think they could share their strengths and weaknesses with each other. I think confidence showed particularly when kids were proactive, they were looking forward to what was next in the lesson. And the assessment card allowed everyone to feel confident, compared with summative assessment where grades could leave some feeling quite disappointed. I think open questions met the aim of NCPE's aim of enjoying communication and learning how to evaluate own success. So, for example, pupils were raising their hands, they were asking their own questions, and the questioning meant that they could think further and they could evaluate on the lesson what happened in the lesson. So, in the future, I could ask pupils to develop further. So I could plan time in the lesson as well for self-assessment, as well as peer assessment of the shouters, where pupils could reflect on their own decisions. They could provide strengths and weaknesses of their own shouters, and this would develop their own critical thinking, and that would meet the NCPE's aim of evaluating own success.
What did you find were the benefits of using this card with the pupils and as a teacher?
So we were in a sensory environment, which I noticed pupils were quite excitable. They were trying to get on with the activities. So I think the resource card allowed me to refocus the children back to the actual learning objective, and the pupils could transfer their physical learning onto the actual resource card, and the questions on the card allow pupils to evaluate And I think it just gave me better behavioural control, which is really important in such a stimulating environment. One of the questions on the card was, what would you do in the future? And I think this provides critical thinking where pupils could decide how they'd improve from what they've learned in the lesson, and it reinforces the learning, which I did this at the end of the lesson by using the resource card. I think the card prompted independent thinking, seeing as though we were using group work throughout the whole lesson.
What did you find were the challenges of using this card and as a teacher?
So I think the card took time, and therefore pupils weren't active during the time of using the card. And one of the NCPE's aim in physical education is to be physically active for a sustained period of time. So I think in future I could use clipboards, and pupils could walk around with the clipboards and use the resource cards as they were going along. Rather than leaving it to the end of the lesson like I did, where people sat down with the resource cards in my lesson. I think I found it quite hard to implement the cards throughout the lesson because I didn't want to disrupt the flow of the lesson and the progression of the lesson. So in future, I could, at each stage of the lesson, once I've made a bit of a progression, I could remind people to look back at their cards, and it could just link back to the learning objective.
How did the resource card allow you to teach an inclusive lesson?
So I was inclusive through the questioning. For example, I used the question, name 1 to 3 safety rules. So the more able pupils could write all 3 answers, the less able could just write 1. And in future I could probably go around and develop these answers a bit further, so I could read their answers and say, so what's important about that, or what could happen if we didn't follow that safety rule. I think I was inclusive with the learning styles of the pupils, so I had read, write learners and spatial learners benefit because I incorporated pictures and writing on the cards. I was inclusive with my teaching styles. I used command at the start when naming the safety rules, which is important, seeing as though OAA is inherently hazard and risky, which is what Sue Thomas and Carol Raymond 2006 stated. As the lesson progressed, I moved towards guided discovery style of teaching, using open-ended questions to develop the pupils' thinking. And then what I did is linked my questions back to the learning objectives to guide the pupils in the right direction when they were building their shelters. Mostyn and Ashworth 2002 defined guided discovery as a teacher using questions and tasks to gradually direct participants towards a predetermined learning target. So although I gave pupils the freedom to use trial and error to build their shelters, I also ensured through my questions that they're remaining on task, and they benefited through the fact that I used command and guided discovery at different times in the lesson.
If you were to create an assessment card in the future, what are the 3 key components you would include?
So I'd use a facial chart system to show how confident pupils were feeling. So smiley face, confident; sad face, not so confident. And this feedback would help me to plan future lessons. So I'd incorporate the areas of weakness where they put sad faces to develop this in future lessons. But also the smiley faces shows where the progression was made. So it allows me to reflect on my lesson. I think that I could be critical based on these smiling and sad faces on my own teaching. I think I'd incorporate images and pictures because they're stimulating and they catch attention of young people, and this will promote engagement of the pupils as they'll be interested, and therefore they will be more willing to engage in the lesson. With the read-write aspects of the card, images actually will help them focus on this because they're very inclusive in terms of SEN pupils who they would particularly benefit, as they find images particularly stimulating SEN pupils, and it highlights their creative perspectives, meaning that they will be engaged as well, and it would allow them to work alongside their peers inclusively. I'd use 2 stars and a wish as well, and this is because I can understand pupil learning from the end at the end of the lesson, from determining if they remained on task with the learning objective with their answers. I could also plan in future again, depending on the wish answer. I could make the task inclusive by asking pupils who are more able to develop their answers on the card of 2 stars and a wish, by saying to these pupils, So what does that mean? And maybe with the less able pupils or the SEM pupils, they could just write one keyword for their answers.
Any other reflections on your lesson?
So I would ensure that I provide sufficient time for questions to be answered, and this would allow opportunity for everyone to answer. And I could do this by prompting someone that isn't willing to put their hand up by using more basic language in the questions, and this would be more inclusive, as I felt that I jumped at the first person that put their hand up, whereas providing a little more time would allow the thinking required, and the less able pupils could have this time they need, and all children would then feel more empowered and more confident as they develop their in-depth thinking. However, the downside to this is that would obviously be more time consuming.